At 18, she was given, still a virgin, to a widowed rancher with 3 children. What happened shocked all. Wyoming, winter of 1878. The wind swept across the barren plains like a blade, slicing through the skeletal trees and howling against the battered siding of a sagging farmhouse. Snow had begun to fall again, slow and deliberate, covering wagon ruts and boot prints, as if to erase all signs of passage. Laura May stood on the crooked wooden porch, her small hands buried in the coarse wool of her shawl. She did not shiver, though the wind was merciless. Her eyes, wide and dry, stared out into the whiteness, as if hoping something, anything, might rise out of it to stop what was coming. Inside the house, her uncle leaned against the hearth, one boot resting on the stone edge, like a man who still thought himself powerful. He was thick-bodied and bitter, his face seamed with years of regret and resentment. Across from him stood a taller man in a worn trail coat dusted with snow. Clayton Ward, 36, widowed. He held his hat in one hand, the other resting at his side. His face was unreadable, jaw set, eyes the color of winter ash. "I told you," the uncle said, voice gruff and sharp. "She's untouched, still a virgin, fresh as morning milk." Clayton said nothing. "She's strong, too, not soft like the saloon girls in town. Raised her on beans and chores. She can carry water, break kindling, mend cloth." He spit into the fire. "A woman like that ought to be worth more than $50, but I'm settling fair." Still, Clayton said nothing. In the corner, the fire popped as if it wanted to interrupt. The silence grew thick between them. Laura's fingers dug tighter into the fabric at her waist. She had not been asked. Not for her thoughts. Not for her consent. Her uncle had never seen her as anything but a burden, another mouth that ate what he could not earn. Her mother had died when she was 12, and no one since had spoken her name with kindness. Outside, the wind howled harder. Clayton finally reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. It clinked as it landed on the table. Beside it, he laid a folded paper, titled to a prize bull. "We're square," the uncle said, rubbing his hands greedily. "She's yours now." Clayton nodded once, turned toward the door, and stepped outside. Laura followed. She did not look back at the house. There was nothing left in it worth remembering. She stepped down the warped porch steps and into the snow beside him. He did not offer his arm. He did not ask if she needed a blanket. The wagon was simple, covered, no decoration, no comfort. She climbed in silently. He followed. When the door closed, the world outside dulled to a muffled hush. Inside, the silence was deafening. Clayton took the reins and gave a low click. The horses started forward, hooves crunching against ice-crusted snow. Laura kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. He did not speak. Not one word. Not even a glance. She did not ask where they were going, or how long it would take. She knew it didn't matter. In that moment, she was not a bride, not a wife, not even a woman. She was a transaction, a solution to someone else's problem. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. Because in this world, a girl's tears didn't buy her freedom. They only froze before they could fall. The Ward Ranch spread out like a frozen sea, quiet, vast, and unbearably still. As the wagon rolled past the front gate, Laura could see a 2-story wooden house standing against the wind, flanked by a barn and 2 smaller sheds. The snow on the roof had begun to melt at the edges, dripping steadily like the ticking of a slow clock. Clayton helped her down but said nothing. He nodded once toward the front door and then walked toward the barn, his footsteps fading behind her like the end of a sentence. Inside, the house was clean, orderly, and cold. Not just from the Wyoming winter, but from something else. A silence that lived deep in the walls. No laughter, no warmth. Just the soft creak of wood, and the faint echo of what used to be. 3 children stood in the hallway, watching her with wide, guarded eyes. The smallest, Rosie, was barely 3. Her hair was a tangle of soft brown curls, and her thumb sat firmly in her mouth. Eli, 6, held her hand protectively, his face solemn, his shoulders stiff like a little man. Micah, 8, stood behind them, arms crossed, jaw tight. He was already his father's son in posture, if not yet in age. None of them spoke. Laura offered a gentle smile. "Hello," she said softly. Rosie blinked. Eli looked down. Micah turned and walked away. It was the beginning. The days that followed passed in a rhythm of uncertainty. Laura woke early, fumbling through unfamiliar chores, hauling water, scrubbing floors, chopping vegetables, hanging linens, trying not to burn the bread. The stove was temperamental. The water pump was crooked. The chickens hated her. She did not know how to saddle a horse or soothe a child's nightmare. She did not know where things went in the pantry or how to sew a sock without stabbing her own finger. She did not know why Rosie cried when the clock struck 3, or why Eli refused to eat carrots. But she tried. Each morning, she rose before dawn and tried to learn what this place expected of her. Clayton never raised his voice. He did not criticize. He barely spoke at all. But every now and then, when she thought no one was watching, she would find new notes pinned quietly beside the stove. Use oak for better heat. Boil potatoes before peeling. Rosie likes her porridge with cinnamon. One morning, she found a slip of paper tucked under a cracked bowl. You don't have to do it all. Just try. She stared at the words longer than she meant to. At night, after she went to bed, she would sometimes hear footsteps downstairs. By morning, she would discover the dishes she left half-washed were now clean and dried. The bread dough she had given up on was baked into soft, round loaves. The firewood she forgot to bring in was stacked neatly beside the hearth. He never said a word about it. The children remained distant. Rosie often hid under the table. Eli hovered by windows. Micah stayed outside long after dark, chopping wood as if it were the only thing that made sense anymore. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Laura baked small rounds of honey bread. She placed one on a chipped plate and left it outside Micah's door. He hadn't said a single word to her in 3 weeks. The next morning, the plate was gone, and in its place was a single pine cone, painted with black ink, as if by a child's hand. She didn't ask. He didn't mention it, but something small shifted. Later that day, she passed by the kitchen and saw that someone with rough hands, had cleaned the soot off the stovetop. Not with a cloth, but with care, and for the first time since arriving, Laura exhaled without trembling. The sickness came without warning. One morning, Rosie refused her porridge. By midday, her cheeks burned with fever, and her tiny body shook beneath her blankets. She whimpered when touched and cried softly in her sleep, calling out for someone who no longer existed. Laura did not panic. She could not afford to. She folded warm towels, soaked them in water boiled with crushed mint leaves she found in the pantry, and laid them gently across Rosie's forehead. She stripped the girl's dress and curled beside her in bed, wrapping her own arms around her like a cocoon. Her own body offered what warmth the fire could not. For 3 nights, Laura did not sleep. She held Rosie when the child cried, sang to her when the coughing rattled her chest, and whispered soft prayers no one taught her, just to fill the silence. When Rosie's throat went dry and her lips cracked, Laura dipped her fingers into honey water and placed drops onto the girl's tongue, one by one. On the 3rd night, sometime after midnight, she glanced toward the window. Clayton stood outside. Snow clung to the shoulders of his coat, but he made no move to enter. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, those distant gray eyes, had changed. He stood there watching, unmoving, while Laura rocked his daughter in her arms like something precious. He left without a word. The next morning, Rosie's fever broke, her breathing softened. She opened her eyes and blinked slowly, lips chapped but no longer trembling. When Laura offered her a sip of water, the child drank, then clutched weakly at her sleeve. "Thank you, Mama Laura," she whispered. The words struck like thunder in a quiet sky. Laura smiled gently, brushed a curl from Rosie's damp forehead, and said nothing. That night, Laura told the children a story by the fireplace, a tale about a coyote who stole the stars and had to put them back one by one. Rosie sat in her lap. Eli leaned against her knee. Micah sat apart, silent, but watching. Afterward, she tucked Rosie in and kissed her brow. The little girl didn't resist. She reached up and held Laura's hand until she drifted to sleep. Still, Micah kept his distance. He helped his father with the horses, cleaned the barn, chopped wood, and barely spoke to her at all. Laura respected it. She didn't force kindness where it wasn't yet welcome. But one cold morning, just after the first thaw, she walked out to the field behind the house with a bundle of small branches in her arms. The grave marker there had been forgotten, weather-worn and crooked. Clara Ward, beloved wife and mother. No flowers, no offering. Just a name carved into old wood. Laura sat in the snow, her fingers red and numb, and began to work. She tied twine around 3 pine branches, then fastened them into a crude but careful cross. She laid it gently at the base of the marker. She didn't know she was being watched. That evening, Micah didn't say a word during supper, but as Laura cleaned up, he walked into the kitchen and muttered, "You spelled her name right." Laura paused, drying her hands on a towel. "I made sure." Micah nodded once, then walked out again. Later that night, Miriam, an older neighbor who sometimes helped with sewing, visited briefly to drop off fabric. As she took her coat, she leaned toward Laura and whispered, "Do you know you're the first person Clayton's let into that room since Clara passed?" Laura blinked. "What room?" "The one you've been caring for Rosie in. That was Clara's room. Clayton hadn't touched the doorknob in 3 years. Outside, snow began to fall again. Clayton remained a silent figure in the house. He never offered praise, never spoke of what he saw. But Laura caught the way he sometimes paused when passing the children's room, how he stood a moment longer outside the kitchen when she laughed at one of Eli's jokes, how his hand brushed the doorframe after she walked through, as if grounding himself to the space she had just occupied. And more than once, when she looked up suddenly, she caught his eyes on her, soft, uncertain, searching. But always, he turned away before she could hold his gaze. Still, something had begun to shift. It was not love, not yet, but it was no longer silence. It was a quiet evening, brittle with cold. The wind had stilled, and the snow outside lay untouched, like a blanket no one dared disturb. Laura had just finished folding the last of the children's clothes when she heard voices, deep and male, coming from the barn behind the house. Curious but cautious, she stepped out onto the porch and followed the low rumble to the side of the barn. The door was slightly ajar. She stood still, careful not to breathe too loudly. Inside, Clayton stood by a lantern, his gloved hands resting on the saddle rack. Opposite him, a man with a thick beard and a laugh that echoed too loudly leaned casually against a post. "So," the man smirked, "how's married life treating you? That girl can't be more than what, 18? Clayton didn't answer immediately. The man continued, voice mocking, "You must be having a fine time with a young thing like that. Bet it keeps the bed warmer than the firewood does, eh?" Laura's breath caught. Clayton's voice came, low and even. "I took her because it was convenient, no feelings involved, just needed someone to keep the house in order, care for the children." The other man chuckled crudely. "That all, huh?" Clayton gave a short nod. "That's all." Laura did not wait to hear more. She turned and walked away, her chest tight, her vision blurry. Her hands trembled as she opened the door to the house and stepped into the dark hallway. The warmth of the fire mocked her now, and the walls that had begun to feel familiar pressed in around her like a cage. She climbed the stairs and went to her small room. There was no sound in the house except the occasional creak of wood and the beating of her own heart. She wrote the letter in silence. "If I am only a shadow, let me disappear into the snow. I will not wait for spring." She folded it carefully and placed it on the table in the kitchen, beside the small bowl of dried herbs she had planned to use for soup the next day. Then, from her drawer, she took the only thing she had ever called hers, a worn leather belt Clayton had repaired without being asked. The stitching was uneven, the thread thick and rough, but it had held ever since. She laid it beside the letter, Outside, the sky had turned silver. She wrapped herself in her coat, pulled her scarf high over her mouth, and stepped into the snow. The wind did not greet her. It simply opened its arms and let her vanish into the dark. It was Eli who woke first. He had been dreaming of wolves, or snow, or Laura. He stumbled from his bed and wandered down the stairs, calling her name softly. When he could not find her in the kitchen, or the parlor, or near the fire where she sometimes slept when Rosie was restless, his calls grew louder. "Laura?" Then he began to cry. His sobs woke Rosie, who began wailing. Micah came down next, confused and barefoot. Clayton descended the stairs 2 at a time. When he saw the letter, his face went pale. When he saw the belt, he closed his eyes. And when Eli cried out her name again, in a voice so broken it could have come from a grown man's chest, Clayton didn't hesitate. He threw on his coat, grabbed his rifle, and ran to the stable. Within minutes, he was gone, riding hard into the night, the snow rising up to meet him like the edge of a cliff. Clayton found her near dawn. The snow had lightened but not stopped. Tracks were faint, nearly gone, but he followed them anyway, guided more by instinct than logic. He rode hard, through thickets and across a frozen creek, until he reached the old stream beyond the hills, where the water still ran under sheets of ice. There, on a fallen log beside the water, he saw her. Laura sat curled in on herself, arms wrapped tight, her scarf damp with frost. Her lips were pale, her cheeks flushed with cold. She looked small, so small. He dismounted quietly and approached, his boots crunching softly over the frozen earth. When she looked up, her eyes met his, but she did not speak. He stood before her for a long moment. Then, without a word, Clayton dropped to one knee in the snow. The breath caught in her throat. He didn't yell, didn't demand, didn't scold. Instead, his voice came rough, quiet, and broken. "I didn't mean for you to hear that." She looked away. "I said it to shut him up," he went on. "He was making jokes about you and me. I thought I was protecting your name." He swallowed hard. "But I hurt you instead." Laura didn't answer. Her hands shook in her lap. Clayton took a breath, his shoulders trembling. Then he said the words like a man digging up something long buried. "I don't know how to love right," he whispered. "I didn't grow up with it, and when Clara died, I sealed the door shut and threw away the key. I thought that was safer for everyone." His voice cracked. "But then you came," he said, eyes shining now. "And somehow, without asking for a thing, you gave everything. You made Rosie laugh again. You made Eli sleep without waking up crying. Micah watches you like he's afraid you'll disappear." A tear slipped down his cheek, startling in its simplicity. "You made this house breathe again." He lowered his head. "And I never once said thank you." Laura blinked, lips trembling, but still silent. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "But if you do, I won't stop you. Just tell me you'll be warm, that you'll be safe." She stared at him, at the man she had feared, then endured, then slowly come to understand. "And finally," she whispered, "I didn't want you to love me. I just wanted to matter." Clayton looked up at her. "You do," he said, "more than you know." The tears came then, quiet, slow, and freeing. Laura reached out, and he rose from the snow to meet her. In his arms, the cold melted away. There were no promises made, no vows exchanged. Just the silence between two people who had stopped running and started listening. Spring returned to Wyoming quietly. The snow gave way to soft green shoots, and the hills rolled out their colors like a quilt, yellows, blues, pinks, scattered among tall grasses. On one such morning, as mist clung low over the pasture, Clayton saddled 2 horses without saying why. "Ride with me," he said simply, handing Laura the reins. She didn't ask questions. She had learned with him. Silence often carried more meaning than words. They rode side by side through the open land, past the grazing cattle and the ridge where Micah liked to fly paper kites. The wind brushed gently across her face, and for a moment it felt like the land was breathing again. He led her to a clearing she'd never seen before, a wide open field blanketed in wildflowers, golden poppies, purple asters, blue columbine. The earth swayed with the wind like a lullaby. Laura dismounted first, her boots sinking into soft ground. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Clayton nodded, dismounting beside her. His face was unreadable, but his hand was steady as he led her a few steps further, to a spot where a small stone marker sat beneath a twisted oak tree. The bark was old, the branches thick and sheltering. She read the name carved into the stone: Clara Ward, beloved wife, mother, keeper of peace. Clayton removed his hat. "This was her favorite place," he said after a moment. "She used to bring the children here when they were babies. Said this field made her believe in heaven more than any church pew ever could." Laura remained quiet, her hands folded respectfully before her. "I scattered her ashes here," he said, 3 years ago. Promised I wouldn't let the land forget her." The wind picked up again, soft and cool. Laura turned toward him, but he was already reaching into his coat pocket. From the lining, he pulled a small cloth bundle. He handed it to her carefully, like something fragile. Inside was a string of pearls, slightly yellowed with age, but polished and warm in her hand. "It belonged to my mother," he said. "She gave it to Clara on our wedding day, said it should stay in the family, passed down to the woman who would raise the next Ward children." Laura stared at the necklace, breath caught in her chest. "I didn't give it to you when we married," he continued, "because I didn't see it as a marriage. I saw it as survival." He looked her in the eyes now, steady, open. "But now," he said, "I see you waking up before sunrise to tend to Rosie's curls. I see the way Eli looks for your nod before feeding the hens. And Micah, that boy hasn't called anyone mama in years, but I think if he ever does again, it'll be you." Clayton reached for her hand, not forceful, just present. "I want my children to grow up calling you mother," he said simply. There was no proposal, no dramatic gesture, no wine, no music. Just wildflowers swaying in the wind, the whisper of trees overhead, and the worn warmth of a man finally laying his heart bare. Laura didn't speak. She couldn't. But she took the pearls with trembling fingers and placed them around her neck. And when she looked back at Clayton, her eyes were filled with something neither of them dared name, but both understood completely. The storm rolled in without warning. By mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened to an angry gray, and the wind howled across the prairie like a wounded animal. The horses, usually calm in their pens, grew restless, snorting, stomping, eyes wide with instinctive fear. Laura was in the kitchen when she heard the scream. It wasn't a long one, just a sharp cry that cut through the wind and pierced the walls like a blade. She dropped the ladle in her hand and ran out barefoot into the yard. Rosie followed close behind, clutching her little doll, confused and frightened. Outside, Eli stood crying near the barn doors, his knees scraped, his small arms trembling. "It's Micah," he sobbed. He pushed me away from the horse. It was mad." Clayton had already mounted his horse by the time Laura scooped Eli into her arms. He didn't say a word. His face was white as bone, his jaw tight. He galloped toward the far end of the pasture where the mustangs were kept. By the time they found Micah, the boy was crumpled in the mud, motionless. Clayton lifted him with trembling arms, holding him close to his chest. The boy's head lolled. Blood streaked his temple. His boots dangled like dead weight. "Micah, no, no, no," Clayton muttered, pressing his cheek to his son's forehead. They rode hard back to the house, and for days, the ranch was locked in silence. The doctor came and went, shaking his head. "He's young, strong. But the brain, well, sometimes it takes time." Time. Laura sat by his bed, day and night. She barely ate. She barely slept. She read from a small leather-bound Bible, sometimes aloud, sometimes just moving her lips in silent prayer. Clayton couldn't stay in the room long. Every time he looked at his son, he seemed to collapse inward. "I never should have let him work the corral," he said once, his voice hoarse. "He's just a boy. I wanted to make him strong, but I broke him." "You didn't," Laura said gently. "He tried to save his brother. That's strength." But Clayton only shook his head and walked away. On the fourth night, as the wind outside quieted and the lamps burned low, Laura leaned close to Micah's ear. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "We're all waiting on you, sweetheart. Rosie made a drawing today with your name on it. Eli's been sleeping with your boots by his bed. And your father, he blames himself for everything." She reached out, brushed a lock of hair from his forehead, and her tears fell on the pillow beside him. "You're not allowed to give up on us, Micah Ward. Not when we finally learned how to love again." The room was still. Then his hand twitched. Laura gasped. She leaned in, heart pounding. His eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly, bleary, confused, but awake. "Micah," she whispered, voice cracking. "Micah, can you hear me?" He blinked, eyes finding hers. Then, with a weak, raspy voice, he asked, "Mama, did you cry for me?" Laura's hand flew to her mouth as the tears came faster. She nodded, unable to speak. Clayton, standing at the doorway, heard the word, "Mama," and staggered back against the wall, pressing a fist to his chest as if trying to hold himself together. The boy had come back. But more than that, he had chosen her. The wedding was small. There were no musicians, no grand procession, no long tables or city guests, just the wind rustling over the field of wildflowers and the sun warming the soft earth beneath their feet. Clayton had chosen the same clearing where Clara's ashes rested, where the oak stood strong and the wildflowers grew in unruly, beautiful chaos. Laura wore a simple ivory dress sewn by hand, with lace Rosie had picked from an old chest in the attic. Her dark hair was braided down her back, and around her neck she wore the same pearl necklace Clayton had given her weeks before. Micah stood tall beside his father in a neatly pressed vest, a boutonniere pinned crookedly to his chest by Eli. Rosie wore a flower crown and clutched her bouquet upside down, humming a tune only she seemed to know. Each child held one of Laura's hands as she stepped into the field. And Clayton, waiting beneath the oak tree in a crisp white shirt and vest that hadn't seen daylight in years, smiled, the kind of smile that made the years fall off his face. "I never thought I'd stand here again," he said when she reached him, "but I thank God I am." The preacher from the nearby town read a short passage about second chances, about love being patient and kind. But it was the vows that made everyone still. Clayton took her hands in his and spoke with the gravity of a man who had once lost everything. "I buried my heart under this tree," he said. "But you came and made it bloom again. You're not just the woman I married. You're the home I thought I'd never have again." Laura blinked back tears. "I wasn't looking for a family. I didn't know how to be anyone's wife or mother. But you, Clayton, you gave me the chance to try. And your children, they taught me how to stay." When they kissed, the wind picked up, sending petals swirling like confetti around them. It was Rosie who cheered first, clapping her little hands, and Micah who stepped forward and said, with a solemn nod, "You look beautiful, Mama." Later that evening the family shared a simple feast, roast chicken, warm bread, wild berry pie. The laughter came easy. For once the house felt like it had always belonged to them all. But just as twilight began to soften the sky, a wagon appeared at the edge of the property. An old man, hunched and pale, stepped down slowly. Laura froze. It was her uncle. His face was sunken now, his hands shaking